I'm going to move us forward then to our next presenter, who is Dr. Cindy Prescott. She's a professor of forest ecology in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia. Her area of expertise includes nutrient cycling, decomposition, forest soils, forest nutrition, soil and forest restoration. And if you haven't seen her name just about everywhere, I sure feel like I have. She was previously the editor of Canadian Journal of Forest Research and is currently an editor of Forest Ecology and Management. So it's a pleasure to meet you as well as introduce you, Cindy. So take it from there, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to talk today. This is a very interesting session. I'm very pleased to be part of it. I'm also grateful to be joining you from the ancestral lands of the Seashelt Nation in coastal British Columbia. We desperately need a paradigm shift in forestry here in British Columbia for the simple reason that it's no longer 1990. I actually thought it was 1990 again a few weeks ago while listening to our Premier and Forest Minister present their new vision for forestry in British Columbia. It was actually nice to remember 1990, as some of you I'm sure will, because it was a simpler time. We had climate change sort of coming in the future, but like many, I was confident that we could tackle it as we had ozone, other pollutants, acid rain, and we'd begun the process for tackling climate change. So what happened? Sadly, it's no longer 1990. Climate change is here, as Linda was telling us about. And what's worse, we have the mother of all disasters on the horizon now. So we really need to change the ways in which we conduct ourselves on this planet, or as Mike was saying, we need a new relationship with the other beings on this planet. I thought it might be instructive to consider a paradigm shift that's going on in agriculture, and that's regenerative agriculture. This is a way of thinking that recognizes farms as complex living systems and strives to work with the ecosystem and embrace its complexity rather than trying to control it and simplify it. So in a lot of ways, it's like complex adaptive system management. But notably, you'll notice at the heart of regenerative agriculture is recognition of the centrality of soil organisms in ecosystem function and the need to promote their diversity and their activities to create a healthy, productive, and resilient ecosystem. And this recognition of the centrality of soil organisms in regenerative agriculture coincides with recent findings in soil organic matter research, which also points to the centrality of soil organisms, especially soil microorganisms, which I'd like to briefly outline some of the key recent findings for you to consider. So we found that soil organisms play key roles in soil organic matter formation. And surprisingly, it was determined that most stable soil organic matter is not plant residues, but it has already been processed by soil microorganisms. And so soil organic matter is mostly microbial products and not plant material. And this includes microbial residues, or their dead bodies, which you can see here. And it's been estimated that soil microbial necromass, or dead bug bodies, could account for up to 80% of the organic carbon in the soil. And we also now recognize the amount of organic matter that's generated by these microbial products, such as biofilm. As you can see here, there's this is a fungal filament running through it, and you can see the asterisks are bacteria, but there's this huge amount of biofilm, microbial stuff that's in between all of this. So huge sources of soil organic matter. And we found that what fuels these microbes especially is root exudates. And here you can see microbes, bacteria sitting on the surface of a root, just waiting for these energy-rich compounds to come out of the roots. And there's some nice photos here on the left of a root embedded in the soil and the root hairs coming off. And then if you look at the end of the root hairs, you can actually see these globlets of exudates that the plants are releasing into the soil and essentially fueling this below ground ecosystem. This recent study found that these inputs from living roots, so not root litter, but inputs from living roots, were 2 to 13 times more efficient than litter inputs in forming both slow cycling mineral associated, what we used to call stable organic matter, as well as fast cycling particulate organic matter. And this includes systems where there are mycorrhizal fungi, because the same thing applies. It goes into the mycorrhizal fungi and then it comes out of them. And so this study demonstrated that there's a rapid transfer of plant photosynthetes to the soil bacteria that you can see here on the surfaces of these mycorrhizal fungal hyphae. So it appears that the key to fueling this whole below ground ecosystem and generating soil organic matter is the flux of simple high energy compounds from roots into the soil. So let's take that to, okay, let's first talk about how we could maybe get plants to release more root exudates. What controls that? And I've been thinking about this for decades actually, and got together with some colleagues and looked into this, and we found that plants exude more carbon from their roots when their above ground growth is inhibited, but photosynthesis continues such that the plant has surplus photosynthetic carbon. And so this happens under conditions in which there's mild inadequacy or deficiency of nutrients, only nitrogen and phosphorus, or water or temperature, which is, like most of the forests that we will ever encounter, are going to be limited to some extent by some of these factors. And so this is what happens: a deficiency of one of these or an excess of CO2 leads to surplus photosynthetes, and the nature of this surplus material will differ depending on which nutrient or factor is most limiting. These then are sent through the phloem. Some go into root growth or storage. Some go into mycorrhizal fungi and then are released either from the root or the fungi as exudates and fuel the below ground ecosystem and generate soil organic matter. So how can we use this new information that's coming in about the soil ecosystems and this flux, the importance of this flux to soil microbes to support the entire ecosystem? And I'd like to suggest what we need to do is really start giving equal thought to this below ground ecosystem as we do the above ground ecosystem. So always apply this lens as well when we're considering all the things that we're doing in the forest, because we know a lot more about this part of it now than we used to. So let's then visit some of our practices, looking at it through this lens and considering what that might mean for the fueling of this below ground ecosystem. So the first one, obviously, is clear-cut harvesting. Looks bad enough when you just see it from the top, but if you then apply that lens and think, what has happened to that below ground ecosystem? It's quite severe. So all of those organisms that are dependent in some form or another on that flux of labile carbon from the roots are cut off. It's just not coming anymore. So maybe what we need to do when looking at it through that lens is consider all of the alternatives that are being promoted for so many other reasons, such as continuous cover forestry or close to nature forestry, or what I would call, looking through the lens I see, continuous root forestry. And what would that look like, and would that not improve things? In British Columbia, this sort of harvesting is called variable retention harvesting. We brought it in the 90s. And you can see it here on the left. We have dispersed retention at 10%, and then in the middle at 5%, and on the right at 30%. And then at the top of the screen, you can see some of the patch retention harvest. And if you think about below ground, that variable retention on the right is probably the one that would provide something akin to continuous root forestry. This is what it looks like above ground. So you could imagine there would be a fair amount of this energy coming into the below ground system. I took a little trip on Google just to see what this looks like on the landscape just within 30 or so kilometers of my place. And I didn't see much of what I was hoping to see. This is what it looks like. And I don't see much of this dispersed retention at all. You can see that we have small groups of bits of forest left in an otherwise clear-cut area. Here's a few, maybe 5% retention on the left and some small patches on the right. Here is one patch amongst essentially clear cuts. And here are some of the others. So I wasn't finding very much in terms of dispersed retention here. And this is consistent with an article that came out last year by lead author Bill Beasy, looking at who was instrumental in getting variable retention brought in British Columbia. And they were looking at what has gone on since it was introduced and adopted and mandated on the coast. And it was kind of surprising to see this. You can see from 1990 to about 2005, there's quite a bit of dispersed retention or a mix of the two going on. And then suddenly after 2008, there is zero dispersed retention and there's only group retention. And this was also demonstrated in this figure, looking at the same time period in terms of the area of timber harvested. You can see clear cutting declined remarkably. Variable retention and partial cutting were quite high at the start and then have gone down to very little. And what you can see, the vast majority is now clear cutting with reserves. And this is just to remind you of what that looks like on the landscape. So although there was a potential for us to move to kind of continuous root forestry, which would have, I think, had positive benefits for the below ground ecosystem, it's clearly not happening at the moment. Some other practices that we could think about, and one is the incorporation of broadleaves or species that have arbuscular mycorrhizal associates, which seem to be quite different in their effects on soil from coniferous species. These have long been regarded to be soil improvers. We know that they change the soil biota and they change the humus form. They also tend to increase soil organic matter in the mineral soil as opposed to in a surface organic layer. And yet they're also very actively removed in our forestry or silvicultural practices. Here's an interesting example from regenerative agriculture research with crop species. What they found was, this is a Magenta experiment in Germany, a very high correlation between plant diversity above ground or plant diversity and soil microbial diversity. And they went further and they collected the exudates, and then they made exudate cocktails from these various combinations of plants. And they found that all of the changes in soil microbial diversity could be explained simply by the nature and abundance of the root exudates coming out of these plants. So this suggests that not only the amount, but also the composition of these exudates differs among different species, and this has profound effect on the below-ground ecosystem. So we have to ask, why are we still brushing or spraying these broadleaf species? And Vic Liefers and colleagues had a great article in CJFR just recently explaining this and saying how our models are all still based on single species with veg management, and these feed straight into the annual allowable cut. And so if you want to proceed and get through the system easily, then what you have to do is just have this sort of forestry where you plant single species and brush out everything else. And it's really constraining our options to make our forests capable of withstanding all of these challenges such as climate change. So I recommend reading that. And it's unnecessary to have such simple models guiding forest management decisions. There's been so much work worldwide on mixed wood management and how we can embrace complexity being 2 species instead of 1 even, and some work in our forest by Richard Kaplan's Phil Kilmo showing it's not actually that hard, especially relative to the positive benefits that we can expect from it, both above ground and below ground. On the coast, red alder, nitrogen fixing trees, also some evidence that it accesses rock phosphorus, it adds nutrients, it builds soil organic matter worldwide, so much more soil organic matter under nitrogen fixing tree species. They are just so valuable, and yet we still brush them to get out of the way. So diversity above ground we know is good. Add to that the positive effects of this diversity below ground. It simply has to happen. And finally, I'll come back to the surplus carbon matter with looking at fertilization. So with fertilization, we're always trying to maximize above ground leaf area and stemwood volume. But we know that comes at a cost below ground, and this is some work by Mona Hogberg, showing that with fertilized plots, with fertilized forests, there's always less in terms of the respiration, which is essentially a sign of the life of the below ground ecosystem, microbial biomass, and fungal biomass. And so we can get that above ground growth, but we have to realize that it's coming at a cost below ground. And this is probably one of the reasons why we also see a decline in mycorrhizal fungi below ground. So how could we do this better, keeping in mind that we need to keep that below ground system active as well? And so I'm just suggesting that what we should do, instead of trying to fertilize to get the maximum amount of above ground growth, maybe there's an optimal zone just below maximal where we get good growth and we can get that growth without cutting off the below ground ecosystem. So quickly, some conclusions. I say we absolutely have to change our relationship with forests. We have to embrace complexity. We now have the knowledge by which we could manage forests intelligently and ecologically. Our policies and practices really need to catch up, and arguments that changing these is too complicated or expensive really should not all override all other concerns now that it's 2021. So these are those papers I mentioned, in case you'd like to have a look at them. And I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Cindy, so much for an excellent presentation, getting us to think a little bit more subterranean. You're correct, at least in my experience, that we're overlooking these things, and this perhaps is a vital source of our monitoring the health of our forests that's easily overpassed because it's out of sight. So thanks for enlightening on that. We have a lot of time for questions, and there's a few in the Q&A box. So Lisa, I'm going to hand that over to you for a minute.
Yes. First one is in BC, isn't there a lot of lodgepole pine? When doing mixed or dispersed retention on a shallow rooted species, doesn't it just encourage them to fall over?
In British Columbia, there's so much diversity of forests that I should not have given the impression that we need to do this on all sites. What we need to do is start making it possible to do some of these things different and not make it so much more work for the forester to try something different. I think I'll leave it at that. Just that, yes, there will be situations where a single species is probably the best thing to do.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Mike Saunders. Was there some key research or climatic event that occurred in the early 2010s that triggered the rapid shift away from dispersed retention? For example, I would imagine that a large windstorm event could create a lot of blowdown or of isolated individuals, triggering a movement away from dispersed retention.
I wish there was an ecological reason. It is probably more a political reason and, of course, an economic reason. We had a government then that was very supportive of industry doing what industry does, and as long as you're creating jobs, go for it. We also had the recession, and so in 2008, which may have been involved too, which is like, okay, we have to cut our costs, and anything other than clear cutting with leaving a little bit somewhere would be more costly. So I don't know what triggered it, and I don't know if they can't recall if they discussed it in the paper what triggered it. But there's been a backsliding on so many fronts in British Columbia that I think it's more of a political state.
Maintaining a photosynthesizing canopy appears critical to lifeboating below ground ecosystems. What is the capacity for tree planting to serve as a lifeboat mechanism versus retention?
I would say much less. Tree planting is good. It's not always necessary, but it is definitely something that is always considered to be a good thing by the public. And if you're not in there tree planting, then they think you're neglecting your duties. So ecologically, I think we might actually do less tree planting than we do. And again, it's largely because people demand it and are outraged if you're not in there planting trees. And they also use that to say, we're doing sustainable forestry because we plant 3 seedlings for every big tree we harvest.
Paul, we have time for one more?
We have plenty of time. We have time for a couple more if they're available.
Super. From Dean Wu, forest species assemblages are expected to change in the near future due to alterations in climate and fire regimes. What changes might occur in the soil microbial ecosystem, and how does this factor into management?
Yeah, it's interesting now, especially like we'd always been thinking about, the leaves, the leaf litter and all that. But now that I'm seeing how much, or we're finding out how much root exudates differ among species, among nutritional states of plants. That's like a direct communication into the soil and at depth as well. So I think the soil microbial community will, ebb and flow will change according to whatever species is there and its nutritional status, and so what it is exuding from its roots or from the mycorrhizal fungi associated with it. So, but given the diversity, the inherent huge diversity of soil microbiota, they're probably, all the players necessary are probably there, so that their relative abundances will just fluctuate with the species that come and go. So I think it's kind of a complex adaptive system in that manner, that it will, it will just go with the flow, almost literally.
From Mike Hopting, is there any work that indicates an optimized level of overstory retention that balances productivity, operational, and growth with soil condition or health?
My impression from reading the BC paper, and also just, my own work on silvicultural systems and soil microbial communities, suggests, if I had to pick a number, I would guess that 30%, just looking from above ground and then imagining those root systems, which of course will expand when the others are no longer there, those root systems and their mycorrhizal networks. I think I would say I would be happy if we had 30% dispersed retention on a clear cut. I would think we are probably doing okay. If it's a patch, then there's something that we found out in all of our silvicultural systems trials back in the 90s. There's something about sort of 10 to 12 meters away, which is probably related to kind of the end of the below ground system of the trees. If each tree is within 12 meters of an edge, or if we keep the patches no more than 24 meters across, then there's probably enough fuel going in there and nutrients being taken out to make the system not so extreme as it is when it is clear cut and has no access to living trees. So that's what I would say, maybe 25 meters in diameter, or 30% would probably do a lot to keep that below ground ecosystem working.
Nice. Okay.
Let's take that last question. Pretty simple. I wonder how the introduction of old world earthworm species affected the North American soil microbiota.
Yeah, so there's a pretty big change for an ecosystem. But again, good, bad, the ecosystem just changes and still functions. And in some might say, well, that's a pretty good thing, because now you probably shifted it towards more of a mole situation. But of course, that will only happen if you have the right tree species there as well. So that might create another situation in which it might, if you've got earthworms, well, if they're surviving there, it's probably an okay site for them. And you could probably increase the fertility of that site by having a broadleaf component in there as well. But, the system will adapt if we stop beating it on the head and forcing it to comply with what we want there. So I think, again, complex and adaptive, and it will change, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing.
Well, thank you, Cindy, so much for an excellent presentation. A lot of things to think about there, and we'll come back around to those. I noticed there's some other questions in the Q&A that are for some of the other presenters, and we hope to circle back to those as well during the panel discussion. But for now, let's give her our warm welcome and thanks for a nice presentation. So thank you so much, Cindy, and please stick around for later. And now